When we speak of suffering, particularly the suffering born from the subtle tyranny of another soul, we do not merely speak of wounds in the flesh or visible scars that others can see. We speak, instead of wounds in the unseen, the trembling fractures of the psyche, the invisible places where the spirit has been pierced, drained, manipulated, and deceived. Narcissistic abuse is not simply cruelty enacted in the open. It is often enacted in silence, in shadows, in whispers that burrow beneath the conscious mind and seed themselves in the unconscious. And the one who suffers most deeply from this is often the empath, the soul, whose essence is built upon openness, receptivity, and a profound instinct to merge with the emotional undercurrents of others. The empath is like a vessel without a lid, absorbing not only the beauty and vitality of the world, but also its poison, its rage, its despair. When such a one encounters the narcissist, the archetype of devouring hunger and hollow self-idolatry, the meeting is not accidental. It is an archetypal dance, a ritual in which one is consumed and the other is fed. Yet, paradoxically, this encounter is also a path, for what is wounded within the empath is precisely that which must awaken, and what appears to be destruction is in fact an initiation. The narcissist, in their shadowed role, becomes an unwilling initiator, a dark priest forcing the empath to confront the final crucible of their own becoming. But what is this final stage? Many believe healing is a return, a restoration to some imagined purity before the wound, before the trauma, before the betrayal. Yet this is not true individuation. The final stage of the empath is not to return, but to transmute. The empaths cannot go back to who they were before the narcissist entered their life. That door is sealed, for to return is to undo the initiation. Instead, the empath must move forward into a state that transcends both victim and savior, into a new form of selfhood, where they no longer exist as a receptacle of others' projections, nor as a martyr to their own longing to heal what cannot be healed. The final stage is the integration of shadow, the acceptance of the archetype of the wounded healer, and the awakening of the self beyond the illusions of both pain and idealized love. Imagine, if you will, the dream of an empath who has endured long years under the gaze of a narcissist. In the dream, they walk through a forest at night, carrying a lantern that glows faintly. Shadows press in from all sides. Suddenly, they see before them a figure, beautiful, radiant, magnetic. The figure smiles, takes their hand, and whispers promises of light and warmth. Entranced, the empath follows deeper into the forest, only to find the figure fading, disappearing into the dark, leaving them alone with the lantern extinguished. Here is the essential experience of narcissistic abuse, the illusion of light that vanishes, the betrayal of trust, the sudden plunge into darkness. Yet the dream does not end there, for in the silence, the empath looks down and realizes that their hands are glowing faintly. their skin itself, emitting the light they sought from another. This is the final stage, the moment of realization that the light was never in the narcissist, nor in the projections of their false promises. The light was always within. The empath, so long trained to reflect, to mirror, to absorb, must finally become the source. The narcissist becomes the crucible, the shadow teacher, forcing the empath to discover that their energy need not be harvested from another, but emanates from the self, from the archetype of wholeness buried in the depths of the psyche. This stage, however, is not reached easily. It comes only after despair, only after the death of illusions. Many resist this death. The empath often clings to the fantasy that if they love more deeply, endure more patiently, forgive more expansively, the narcissist will finally reveal their hidden heart. This is the archetype of the redeemer gone astray, the healer consumed by the wound. Yet, as I have seen in countless souls, there comes a breaking point. The empath awakens one day not with anger, nor even with grief, but with a strange stillness. It is as though something in them has finally dissolved the need to prove their worth through suffering. The compulsion to heal the unhealable. In the stillness, the empath recognizes that what they were chasing was not love, but a reflection of their own unlived shadow. The narcissist, in truth, is a mirror of the empath's disowned hunger, their own secret yearning to be seen without giving endlessly, to be adored without effort, to be the center of another's world. The empath, who has so long judged this desire as selfish or unworthy, projects it outward and encounters it embodied in the narcissist. Thus, the dance is not merely interpersonal, it is archetypal, a union of opposites, in distortion only when the empath dares to reclaim this disowned hunger, to acknowledge that to contain a shadow that longs for recognition, can the projection dissolve. The narcissist then loses their power, for they no longer carry the disowned piece of the empath's soul. And so the final stage is not forgiveness in the shallow sense, nor is it vengeance, it is integration. It is the empath looking into the abyss of what they have endured and recognizing in it the pattern of the psyche's deepest law, that wholeness can only emerge when light and shadow are reconciled. To reject the narcissist entirely is to reject the shadow. To cling to them is to remain ensnared in projection, but to see them as the dark midwife of one's own individuation is to achieve freedom. Consider the archetype of the alchemist working at their furnace. The base material, corrupted and impure, is placed into the fire. The alchemist does not despise the base material, nor does he worship it. He subjects it to fire, to dissolution, to transformation. So it is with the empath. The narcissist is the lead, heavy, toxic, unrefined. The empath is the alchemist, though they do not realize it. At first, through suffering, they are forced into the furnace of despair, and in that crucible, they awaken to their own capacity to transmute. When they emerge, they are no longer leaden victims, but beings of gold, luminous, not because they are untouched by darkness, but because they have passed through it and claimed its wisdom. Yet I must warn you, this stage is not the triumph of the ego. Many empaths, upon breaking free, to believe they have conquered, that they are stronger, superior, immune. But this is merely another mask of the ego, a brittle defense against vulnerability. The true final stage is humility before the self. It is the recognition that one's survival, one's awakening, was not the work of egoic will, but the unfolding of the self, the archetype of totality that guides each soul toward individuation. The empath bows before this inner self, realizing that even the darkest suffering was part of a larger design, a mysterious pattern in which nothing was wasted. I have seen patients who, after long years of abuse, described themselves as dead, hollow, emptied. Yet, when they began to dream again, when symbols arose from the unconscious, I witnessed a rebirth. One dreamed of a serpent shedding its skin, leaving behind the pale husk of its former self. Another dreamed of a cracked vase, from which flowers bloomed despite the brokenness. These images are not random. They are the psyche's testimony that the final stage is not annihilation, but transformation, not emptiness, but renewal. The empath, when they arrive here, no longer seeks to merge blindly with others. They recognize the sacred boundary of the self, not as a wall, but as a membrane that breathes in and out, allowing connection without annihilation. They become healers, not by compulsively absorbing pain, but by radiating presence. They love without desperation, forgive without erasing themselves, give without self-destruction. The narcissist no longer defines them. The shadow no longer frightens them. They have become whole, and in that wholeness, they are finally free. This is the mystery. The empath's final stage is not weakness overcome, no power seized, but self-realized. It is a return to the archetypal center, where the opposites reconcile, where the wound becomes the source of wisdom, and where the soul discovers that even the darkest initiations serve the light of individuation. There is a peculiar silence that arrives when the empath begins to step out of the labyrinth of abuse. It is not the silence of peace at first, but of emptiness. Many describe it as though they are standing in a vast, abandoned hall, where the echoes of voices once tormented them, and now there is only the ringing of their own footsteps. This silence is terrifying to one who has lived so long by tuning themselves to the emotions of others, for the empath has known themselves primarily through reflection, through mirroring the grief of another, through feeling the unspoken despair of a partner, through absorbing currents of pain that swirl around them like invisible winds. When that mirror is shattered, when the narcissist is gone, when the tether is cut, the empath is left with a question they can no longer avoid. Who am I without the storm? This question is the threshold of the final stage. For only in the barren silence of this hall can the true self speak. The empath begins to sense that what they called compassion was, at times, a defense against their own terror of abandonment. That what they called love was sometimes a refusal to meet their own emptiness. Here the archetype of the desert arises. The desert is the place where every false oasis must be revealed as illusion, where the wanderer is forced to confront thirst until they realize the spring is within. The empath, stripped of external anchors, feels the scorching heat of solitude. Yet within this solitude, the first seed of individuation germinates. Often dreams appear at this stage. I recall one in which a patient described being pursued through endless corridors by a shadowy figure. At last they entered a room with no doors and no windows. The pursuer vanished, leaving them alone. In the center of the room was a mirror. As they gazed, they saw their reflection dissolve into light. This is the psyche's way of showing that what they flee, what they fear in the narcissist, is ultimately an image leading back to themselves. The abuser has forced them into the room without exits, the place where they must finally encounter the self, and though at first it seems a prison, it becomes a birthplace of liberation. It is not unusual for the empath to feel anger rising here. Anger not only at the narcissist but at themselves, at their own complicity, their own blindness, their own ceaseless giving. This anger is sacred. Too often empaths have been taught that anger is forbidden, that to be good is to be endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving, yet repressed anger festers in the unconscious, breeding resentment and self-betrayal. When the anger finally erupts, it is not a regression but a movement toward wholeness. For anger, when integrated, becomes the fire that burns away illusion and establishes boundaries. Without it, the empath remains a saintly ghost, drained of vitality. With it, they begin to stand in their own body, to claim their right to exist not only for others but for themselves. This is where the shadow work deepens. For the empath must admit the shadow of their own desire for control, their own unconscious manipulation through self-sacrifice. Yes, it is painful to see, but here lies the truth. The empath has not been only victim, they have also derived identity, power, even moral superiority from their role as giver, healer, martyr. To admit this does not negate the cruelty of the narcissist, but it brings balance. It rescues the empath from the prison of innocence. True individuation does not rest on the fantasy of being purely good, but on embracing the paradox that we are light and darkness, wounded and wounding, healer and manipulator. Only when the empath sees their reflection in this dark mirror do they become free of the compulsive need to repeat the pattern. Consider again the alchemical image, the conjunction of opposites. The empath and the narcissist are two poles of the same archetypal spectrum, one giving without end, the other taking without limit. Both are imbalanced expressions of the same psychic energy. The final stage for the empath is to integrate the very qualities they projected outward They must learn to say no, to stand in the center, to embody a healthy measure of what the narcissist distorted: self-assertion, desire, power. The narcissist took these to extremes. Divorced from empathy, the empath must reclaim them. Tempered by compassion, in this synthesis, they become whole. At this point, many describe feeling as though they are shedding a skin, much like the serpent. The old identity of the boundless giver cracks and falls away. The empath begins to experience themselves as a sovereign being, not merely a reflection of others' needs. They discover a paradoxical truth. Only when they stop absorbing others' pain compulsively do they actually begin to heal others authentically. This is because healing now flows not from depletion, but from overflow, from the radiance of a self that has tasted its own depths. There is a profound archetype at work here. The wounded healer, the empath who has endured narcissistic abuse, becomes, in time, one who can guide others through the same labyrinths. But unlike before, when they sought to heal in order to secure love, now they heal. Because healing is the natural fruit of their own wholeness, they no longer need to rescue in order to justify their existence. They have passed through death and rebirth, and what they give now is not desperation, but wisdom. Yet I caution you, the path is not linear. The final stage does not erase the past, nor does it immunize the empath against future wounds. Rather, it equips them with awareness. They may still encounter narcissists, still feel the pull of old patterns, but now a voice within whispers, "This is the shadow's dance. You need not enter again." The empath may feel the temptation, but no longer confuses it with destiny. This is freedom not from pain, but from compulsion. The image that often comes is of a butterfly emerging from the chrysalis. The chrysalis itself was formed by suffering, by the suffocating grip of manipulation. Within it, the empath dissolved, their old identity liquefied, and then, at the appointed time, the wings unfold, fragile at first, trembling, but soon carrying them into realms they never imagined. The narcissist, once the captor, has in truth been the cocoon, the dark container within which transformation occurred, and here lies the mystical dimension. In the language of myth, the empath has undergone a descent into the underworld. They have been Orpheus, searching for love in the depths, only to lose it. They have been Persephone, abducted into Hades, forced to eat the pomegranate seeds of shadow, and like all initiates, they return changed, carrying within them a knowledge that cannot be taught by words alone. They have touched the archetypal night and emerged bearing the light of consciousness. This is why I say the final stage is not merely recovery. Recovery implies going back, but individuation is never about going back. It is about becoming. The empath, after narcissistic abuse, is no longer who they were. They are not merely healed, they are transfigured. And this transfiguration carries a responsibility to live authentically, to no longer betray themselves, to honor the voice of the self above the clamors of others, so the silence that once terrified them becomes the silence of inner strength. They learn to dwell in solitude without collapse, to feel without drowning, to love without losing themselves. Their compassion deepens, paradoxically, because it now includes themselves. They see the narcissist not as an eternal enemy, but as an embodiment of shadow, a figure that forced them to claim their own soul. And in this recognition, forgiveness may come, not the shallow forgiveness of condoning harm, but the profound forgiveness of understanding that even the darkest figures serve the mystery of wholeness. This, then, is the empath's final revelation, that they were never powerless, never broken, never defined by the abuse. They were undergoing an initiation written in the archetypal language of the psyche, and now, standing on the other side, they carry not only scars but symbols, not only memories but meaning. The narcissist has taken much, but in taking, they have paradoxically given the empath themselves. There is a moment, often quiet and unnoticed by the outer world, when the empath feels the first pulse of a deeper center within themselves. It comes not as triumph, nor as grand revelation, but as a subtle whisper. You no longer need to beg for what you already are. This whisper is the self, long buried under layers of projection, finally rising to the surface. And in that rising, a new stage of existence begins, one that is not defined by how much pain they can carry, nor how deeply they can love the unlovable, but by how clearly they can see the patterns of the psyche that have bound them. For too long, the empath has been trapped in the archetypal dance of savior and victim. The narcissist played the role of predator, but underneath this was the empath's secret agreement to keep giving so as not to face their own shadow. And now, at last, the curtain has lifted, and the empath sees that their suffering was not meaningless, but it was also not accidental. The psyche does not permit such intensity without purpose. The self guides through symbols, through projections, through relationships that seem fated, until the soul can no longer avoid its own hidden truth. The empath begins to notice dreams that shift in tone. Once, their dreams were filled with pursuit, with helplessness, with endless labyrinths. Now images emerge of thresholds, of gates, of bridges. One dream I remember described by a patient was of standing on a cliff and seeing a bridge of light extending across an abyss. At first they hesitated, terrified of the void, but then they realized the light came from their own chest, creating the path forward. Such images are not hallucinations, they are revelations of the unconscious, pointing toward the stage of wholeness. The empath is no longer fleeing the shadow, they are building the way forward with their own essence. But this forward path demands sacrifice. It demands the death of old identities, old comforts, old illusions. The empath must relinquish the belief that their worth is tied to suffering, that their love can rescue what is unwilling to change, that martyrdom is noble, these illusions, while once necessary for survival, now become poison. If they cling, they will stagnate, repeating the same cycles with new faces. Only when they dare to let the old self die can the new self emerge. This is why so many describe this stage as a kind of death. It is a descent not only into grief for what was lost, but grief for the self that never truly existed, the self that was always defined by others. In this grief, the archetype of the phoenix comes alive. The fire burns away the false feathers, the ashes consume what was illusory, and from the ashes something winged and immortal arises. The empath, through pain, is reborn not as a vessel, but as a flame, and yet, paradoxically, this rebirth does not lead them away from the world, but deeper into it, where once they dissolved into others, now they meet others as equals, not as savior or victim. Their compassion no longer imprisons them, for it is bound to the truth of discernment. They can say no without guilt, yes without desperation. They can witness suffering without drowning in it. They can love without losing their center. This is the fruit of individuation, to stand whole and allow others to be whole, without compulsion, to control either through giving or withholding. The empath now encounters the archetype of the wise elder within themselves. This figure may appear in dreams as a guide, a sage, a mysterious figure who speaks in riddles. At first, the empath resists, for they have long believed wisdom must come from someone else, someone stronger, someone more powerful. But gradually, they realize this elder is their own soul, speaking back to them from the depths the wisdom they sought in the narcissist, the promise of validation, the aura of certainty was always a distorted reflection of this inner elder. Now they begin to listen inwardly, to trust the voice that whispers, not in manipulation but in truth. Yet even here, the journey is not without trials. The empath, now awakening to their own wholeness, may feel estranged from the world they once knew. They may look at friends, family, society, and see patterns of unconscious manipulation everywhere. At first, this can feel isolating, as though they have ascended a lonely mountain, but in time, they see that this vision is not meant to separate them, but to empower them. For once one has passed through the crucible of narcissistic abuse and emerged with the self intact, they are uniquely equipped to shine light into the collective shadow. It is here that many become healers, therapists, artists, mystics, not because they are trying to save the world anymore, but because their very being radiates the presence of someone who has integrated shadow and light. Others sense it in authenticity, a steadiness, a compassion free of agenda, and in this presence, others begin their own awakening. This is the empath's final gift, not the compulsive gift of overgiving, but the natural gift of wholeness. One must understand the final stage is not perfection, it is not that the empath never feels fear, never feels pain, never longs for love. It is that these emotions no longer rule them unconsciously. They can observe their own shadow without being possessed by it. They can see their own wounds without collapsing into them. They can even encounter another narcissist, and instead of being ensnared, they recognize the archetypal pattern immediately and step aside. This is mastery, not of domination, but of consciousness from the mystical perspective. This is the soul's return to its axis. The self is the mandala, the circle with the center point. For so long, the empath orbited outside, spinning around others' needs, others' shadows, others' illusions. Now, slowly, they return to the center. From here, the opposites no longer tear them apart. They see that love and anger, light and dark, giving and receiving, all belong to the same whole. They no longer fear the shadow, for they know it is the gate to wisdom. They no longer idolize the light, for they know light without shadow is blinding. They have entered the sacred tension of opposites, and in this tension, they are whole. It is as if the empath becomes a living symbol. Their very life becomes myth, not in the sense of fantasy, but in the sense of embodying archetypal truth. They are the one who has descended into the underworld and returned carrying the fire of consciousness. They are the one who has faced the devourer and emerged unconsumed. They are the one who has shed the old skin and now walks with wings. In their story, others see their own, and thus the cycle continues, not of abuse, but of awakening. This is why I tell you, the final stage of the empath after narcissistic abuse is not merely survival. It is individuation. It is the journey from projection to possession to integration. It is the path through shadow into self. And in this final stage, the empath ceases to be defined by the wound and becomes defined by the wholeness that grew from it. They become not only healed, but healers, not only free, but liberators, not only whole, but symbols of what it means to be fully human. As the empath steps fully into this last stage, there is a profound shift in perception. The world that once appeared only as a battlefield of givers and takers now reveals itself as a great tapestry of archetypes, woven together by forces larger than any single personality. The narcissist is no longer simply the abuser, but an image of the devouring archetype, the unintegrated shadow of hunger. The empath is no longer merely the victim, but an image of the open vessel, the archetype of receptivity. When these two collide in human life, it is painful, even devastating. But when seen from the perspective of depth psychology, it becomes clear that such collisions are not only tragedies, they are initiations into the mystery of the self. The empath, having endured, begins to see their suffering as part of a myth that is both personal and universal. They recognize themselves in ancient stories, in sacred texts, in the symbols carved into the collective unconscious. They see that they have been Persephone descending into the underworld. Inanna stripped of her garments before the gates of the underworld, Christ bearing the cross, the wounded healer who discovers medicine in their own wound. This recognition does not erase the pain, but it lifts it into meaning. For meaning is what the soul craves most, not avoidance of suffering, but transformation of suffering into purpose. At this stage, the empath often feels a surge of creative energy. What once drained them now fuels them. The pain that silenced their voice now demands expression. Some begin to write, to paint, to sing, to counsel, to guide. Others simply live with a radiance that cannot be hidden, embodying what they have become. For the self, once revealed, is not content to remain silent. It presses outward, shaping life in accordance with the truth that has been uncovered. The empath, by becoming whole, becomes a vessel of transmission for the archetypal forces that live in every human being. Yet there is humility here. The empath knows now that they are not beyond shadow, not immune to projection, not elevated above others. They know too well the fragility of the psyche, the subtlety of manipulation, the ease with which illusion can reappear. This humility is the mark of one who has truly integrated, for they know they are human, not divine, finite, not invulnerable, but they also know that the self within them is larger than their fragility, that wholeness does not mean perfection, but integration. The final stage is thus characterized by paradox. The empath feels stronger, yet softer, more discerning, yet more compassionate, more whole, yet more aware of their own complexity. They can look back on their story and see both the cruelty and the gift. They no longer need to erase the darkness to honor the light. Both are woven into their being. And in this paradox, they find peace, not the peace of absence, of conflict, but the peace of standing in the center of life's opposites without being torn apart. Dreams at this stage often reveal mandalas, circles, spirals, or images of union. One dreamer told of finding a garden within a ruined city where flowers bloomed through cracks in the stone. Another spoke of swimming in dark waters only to discover pearls glowing at the bottom. These are not accidents, they are the psyche's affirmation that integration has been achieved, that the ruined city of abuse now contains a secret garden, that the dark waters of suffering conceal treasures that can only be found by descent. It is here, finally, that forgiveness emerges not as obligation, not as denial, but as a natural consequence of wholeness. The empath does not excuse the narcissist, does not condone their cruelty, but they see that to remain bound in hatred is to remain bound to the abuser. Forgiveness here is not a gift to the narcissist, but to the self. It is the release of the chains of resentment, the willingness to let the shadow return to the depths where it belongs. In this release, the empath is no longer defined by what was done to them, but by what they have become. And what they have become is a bearer of light forged in darkness, a healer who has walked through the wound, a soul who has touched both shadow and self and come through intact. They are no longer merely an empath, but a whole human being. The narcissist was a crucible, but the fire revealed gold. This is why I say the final stage of the empath is not survival, but transfiguration. They no longer live as a reflection of others, they live as themselves, radiant, whole, unafraid of their own depths. They embody the truth that the psyche seeks not safety but wholeness, not avoidance of shadow but integration of it. And in living this truth, they become a symbol for others, a reminder that even the darkest initiations can lead to the birth of the self. So I leave you with this. Do not despise the path you have walked, however cruel it has been. Do not seek only to erase the past, for the past is a seed of your transformation. Do not cling to illusions of purity or perfect goodness, for wholeness lies beyond such illusions. Instead, stand in the center of your own being. Look into the shadow without fear. Listen to the whisper of the self and know that you have already passed through the fire, and what remains is not the fragile vessel you once were, but the indestructible light that was always hidden within you. This is the final stage of the empath, to realize that what was broken was the shell, not the essence, to see that what was taken was only illusion, not the soul, to understand that the abuser was not the end of their story, but the dark gate through which they entered their true beginning. And when you walk through that gate, when you emerge on the other side, you will know with a certainty that does not need words. You are whole, you are free, you are self. And no shadow can ever take that from you again.